one thing that I observed and kind of heard that's very similar in between your statements was the judgment, right? The observing, the actual stepping back and looking at the emotion and looking at the situation, whatever you may be feeling, is taking the label off of whatever it is that you're experiencing in that present moment. Does that make sense?
Now there's a element in which everyone brought up, which was like the feelings, right? And trying to separate from feeling. But I think there's a great observation there where we never truly separate from feelings, but we can separate from identifying with feelings. So because trying not to feel is also bringing in the judgment that I'm feeling this, right? So we're trying not to feel so that we can become aware. But the awareness can be a step even further back, is being aware that I'm feeling this, right? And then not judging that as a thing that I shouldn't do or I should do.
So this is important to break down because in the body, right? And let's break down the what an emotion is, right? An emotion is a set of physiological responses. You guys know what physiological responses are, right? Heart rate, sweaty palms, shaking, right? All of these different physical things that you're feeling in your body. That's what happens first. When you package that up together, it's an emotion, right? Electricity, because all of those things are happening because of electricity in motion. Your feeling is the label that you place on the thing that you're experiencing, right? But at the end, and its root cause, it's all the same thing, right? Heart rate starts to increase, right? Maybe your hands get sweaty. Maybe you start shaking a little bit, whatever the case may be. Maybe you feel excitement, right? In the terms of like, you feel like running, you feel like jumping, all of these different things. Those are physiological responses. Your judgment on it, the feeling, is the label you place on that thing that you're experiencing.
So in the sense it starts in that physiological response. Okay, my heart rate is starting to elevate. I'm feeling my heart rate. And then I look for meaning. What does this mean? It must mean that I'm nervous, or it must mean that I'm excited. Either way, that judgment that I place is where the thought process and the feeling, the emotions, the responses from my body meet, right? So how would I decide if I'm excited or I'm nervous? Because if we look at the response, the physiological response, how are they different? Palms are sweaty, knees weak, arms are heavy. Okay. If we're feeling our heart rate raising, our hands are clammy, we're feeling that butterflies in our stomach, right? We can look at those things and say, is this excitement or is this nervousness, right? Because they're fundamentally the same thing. What I do now is I process the environment, what's going on, and then I use that to interpret what this means, and I attach that label. Okay, this is nervous. I'm nervous right now.
I'm nervous because I'm standing in front of a bunch of people. Or I'm excited because I'm gonna get on a roller coaster. Same physiological responses, different label.
So now, when we go back into the idea of awareness, is recognizing, now taking a step back of, oh, I feel these responses in my body. I have the thought of interpretation of what's happening. And then I want to take the action of putting that feeling, that label onto what's going on internally. Now I do that, I put that label on. Now I'm going to decide how I'm going to behave moving forward. I'm going to decide what this means to me. I'm going to attach meaning because of all of these aspects. So the act of awareness is stepping out and watching these things happen internally, physiology, and deciding, having an active decision behind what happens next. Now that active decision, you may not be aware of where that active decision comes from, because we can be so practiced in our responses to things. We can be so practiced in our response that we don't actively stop and make a decision. This is how I'm going to act here, right? So our reaction is, one of the coaches here brought up this great breakdown of reaction, right? Reacting, you're reenacting something. So if you come up here and poke me, and my reaction is to do this, My reaction is what I've acted, what I've practiced, what I've done over and over and over again is why I do that response, which is a habit. So taking a step back, if we become aware, now we raised our ability to stop that reaction and recognize that we have a choice. So that's what awareness allows us to do, to step away from the judgment.
And now it's also important to understand that, like, okay, so we had this reaction. You fall back to your training, right? So you have however many years old you are, you've reacted to different situations, life situations, physical situations in your life. So you're going to react a certain way based on that training. The awareness is not placing judgment on that reaction. It's literally letting that reaction happen. And then the second that it happens after, it's like seeing it, observing it, and then asking yourself, what made me react this way? Important. Not why, what made me react this way? Because it's the external information that you're receiving from your external world that is making you react that way. How you perceive that external information that's coming in through your senses, through your eyes, touch, taste, smell, right? That information is what's making you react. If you observe how you're actually receiving it and you pause and you say to yourself, what made me react that way versus why did I react that way? Now you start to create non-judgmental observation on the reaction. Why starts to kind of create more judgment when you go into that space.
Mm-hmm. So that idea of judgment and that's huge because it's all in the perspective of how you see it, right? The judgment is going to come in based off of, again, what Moses mentioned, which is that training, right? You falling into that level of training. You've trained yourself to think that this is a bad quality of yourself. So then, therefore, that bad is the judgment. So now it comes up, that judgment becomes automatic along with the entire cycle. So that judgment is recognizing that that judgment itself is coming from a place, becoming aware that that judgment is coming in because of something else and so on and so forth. So what about this makes me judge this moment? Go a step deeper. What about this makes me react? What about this makes me feel? What about this makes me have this emotion? So we can take that step back and always ask the question of what, like Moses mentioned, and we start to use awareness to observe what we're experiencing. And in that observation, we get to really identify our behavior and patterns.
So we're going to practice this today a little bit. But for example, you're feeling depressed, you're feeling sad, right? There's a situation, let's say a breakup, right? Everybody here experienced a breakup or a loss of a relationship before? Yes? Never. I think we can all find a common ground there. So a lot of people will break up with somebody and then ask themselves, they feel sad. Why am I feeling sad? Why am I feeling depressed? Well, the why starts to lead to create assumptions into why we're experiencing the thing we're experiencing. It doesn't allow you to question yourself. It doesn't allow you to ask, what are the beliefs that you have about yourself that is creating this emotion or this feeling that is making you feel sad or depressed or whatever the thing is. What we want to experience is the what. What about myself is making me feel this way? How am I interpreting my situation? How am I perceiving that? Because when we ask why am I feeling this way? Then we start to place judgment on the external thing that's actually happening, which is, well, maybe I'm not good enough, or maybe I'm not pretty enough, or maybe I'm not strong enough, or maybe, and then you start pointing out all the limiting beliefs that exist within you. And then you just start looking at that versus asking, what is creating this feeling inside of me? Make sense?
So like to just flip that coin on something that you're really proud of, that you're really good at, do the same practice. If you ask yourself, what about this makes me so proud versus why am I so proud about this? The same reaction comes because when you're trying to answer why, you're trying to come to a conclusion. It no longer inspires curiosity. it looks for an answer, for a response of why, the meaning. And that's what we're talking about, is the meaning that we attach to things. The meaning that we attach to things is our label, our judgment, and that's what leads to that perspective of like, oh, like Moses said, either this is a limiting belief or this is an empowering belief. That idea comes from that label, which comes from that judgment.
So let's do what we call here teach and turn. So you're gonna go turn to someone on your right or left, right? You just got here. So you guys can catch each other up. What I want you to do is just talk about some of the main points that you caught in awareness, right? And maybe possibly discuss one of your experiences in where you were able to identify this awareness in your life. All right, we'll give you, let's do 4 minutes. 4 minutes, go. How do we know that it's not limiting us?
It could be limiting you, yeah.
Right? We can have a story in our head that's like, oh, wow, we're so great. We're so amazing. This is why I am the way that I am. But actually, it's the thing that might be getting you from the next stage to your life or making the next 100,000 or 50,000, whatever it is. So how do we identify those things?
So with the context of what is, again, going back to the label of judgment, right? What is empowering and what is limiting is also a judgment of the thing. So how do we identify that this is moving us forward or moving us back? Is first identify what direction are we heading, right? So if we're heading to Florida, right? But I'm heading east and I say, hey, I'm trying to go west. And you tell me you're going the wrong direction in context to where I'm heading. So what makes it empowering or disempowering is simply that it's not taking me towards the direction that I want for myself. So to me, the label of that comes from also awareness in understanding self. Before you even go into beliefs and go into identifying if this is empowering or disempowering, we start to build up an idea by getting to know what brings life to us, by exploring our environment, and also recognizing that we're trying to learn, we're trying to become aware of what interests us. What are we trying to achieve? What is the purpose behind this? Is it just enjoyment and fulfillment? Okay, that could be a thing. So then if I'm here for enjoyment and fulfillment, and I'm doing something that stresses me, therefore this doesn't take me towards the direction I want to go, right? Or maybe, no, I'm here for, say, awakening, right? So if here I'm only getting enjoyment and fulfillment, no awakening, then this is not empowering to me. So I think it's first understanding, using that awareness, understanding what we want, what our desires are, which is a journey within itself, right? An explorative journey of understanding what all of our experiences bring to us. What values do we hold within ourselves? What mission are we trying to accomplish with our lives?
To further that point, it's the idea that a belief is fixed too, right? So a belief that you had when you were 13, 14 years old may have served you at that time in the environment, in the present moment that you were in. If you hold that same belief all the way up to 30, 40, it may not be serving you the same way. But the whole idea that a belief is fixed is saying that you are some type of person. At Vita Project, we don't believe that because we believe in neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that you're able to change the physical wiring in your brain, which means that those physical wirings are actually beliefs. The idea of you, the representation of yourself, your identity. So therefore, if we understand that our brain can change, we understand that our beliefs about ourselves can change. So then the premise behind this is that beliefs are not fixed. You can actually take them out like parts and replace them, right? Through training. There's actual training and mindset training that you can do by literally taking out, creating awareness. First step, creating awareness with that belief. Asking yourself, is this serving me right now? Is this propelling me to the vision that I have for myself? If it doesn't, what is the belief that I need in order to get me to that point? So we have to understand that beliefs are not fixed. They're actually part of a growth mindset. We can replace them whenever we want. And maybe, we get a belief that empowers us now to get us to a certain point in our life. And then we get to that point and it's like, well, this doesn't work anymore. Let's throw that out. Let's put a new one in.
So like Moses mentioned, like childhood perspective, right? If you were a child that grew up in an abusive home, you developed a lot of skills and beliefs that protected you, that help ensure your survival. Those were empowering beliefs at the time because you were trying to survive. That was the intention behind what you were achieving for yourself. As you grow up into an adult, you're no longer in that environment, let's say. Now, with that awareness, you can recognize what that belief was, how did it play a role, what the experiences were that made you find that conclusion. With awareness, you see all of that, and you're able to now place that judgment of like, okay, now this is disempowering because now I'm trying to do this. Now I'm trying to build a relationship with someone that needs me to be able to show up, not to give the next point, vulnerable enough with them. All right, so now these protective beliefs, these protective skills that I developed are no longer serving me because what I'm trying to achieve is a relationship.
So I got a question for you. How many of you, when we tell you that you're not a type of person, that you're not any type of person, have resistance towards that? Like you feel maybe some kind of like, I don't know if I believe that. Do you believe that you're capable of the change?
Oh, yes.
Okay, good.
Stan, you did the Indian head.
So iffy about it.
What was your thoughts going through?
Like I believe it, but I don't know. I know it's hard work, and you have to really want it, I guess.
So you're talking about the feeling, the emotion of like,
Always go there.
yeah. Because like we can build a vision of ourselves, right? A future. And if we don't necessarily feel it, it's kind of hard to believe that it can happen, right? So then it's like, I should be thinking that I can change. Everybody says humans are capable of change, but why the fuck should I believe that? Right? The emotion is what drives the action. So then how do we start to create that emotion to build that action is the hard part. And that goes into vulnerability.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say one point with that. What Moses mentioned at the beginning, right? Electricity in motion, right? Another format is energy in motion, right? The energy that goes into our body of feeling these things and then taking these thoughts and applying them to these emotions and attaching that label, right? All of that is energy, is forceful energy that's going to a direction, right? So if I get angry and I start screaming, right? That's energy that's being released, right? I'm building that energy inside and releasing. If I'm scared and my whole body is shaking, that's energy that's being released. So what we can understand from that energy aspect is that we are using energy. It's how we decide with awareness, how we decide to apply that energy. Because all this energy, whatever emotion or feeling is attached to it, is still energy that's propelling some sort of action. Is how do we take that energy and propel it towards, again, that future self, what we're trying to build. And then what we realize is that there's tons of motivation and energy if we know how to tap into ourselves and we're able to take that and funnel it towards what we're trying to create for ourselves. So I know you're supposed to talk about this over here.
Let's do the exercise.
Okay.
Let's do the exercise because I think that can drive your point home. The nervous system. That's what it all comes back down to. Your nervous system. Your nervous system receives information from your eyes, your nose, taste, touch, right, smell, right, all of these things. And then it gives you responses, sends different chemicals, hormones, all of these different things to your body for you to take action on that information. The only thing that stops you from changing anything in your life is your perception of that experience. Literally, how you perceive what you're feeling, that judgment is what's stopping you. That then creates a belief. And this is why vulnerability is so important. These without, like for us, change begins awareness and vulnerability. Without those two, it's not going to happen. You can have all the awareness in the world. You don't have vulnerability, not going to happen. You can be as vulnerable as possible. You're not even aware that you have a problem, not going to happen. Change does not occur without those two things. The idea that you guys were vulnerable, Diane, the idea that you came up here and you expressed those judgments, you were vulnerable about how you were feeling in that moment, right? You thought the world was going to end. You gave an opportunity for some other people to see that. And now you have an opportunity to change that story. It's just a moment, but you have one story, one possibility to change it. And now it no longer has to be Diane. Diane no longer has to be this person who gets nervous every single time when she comes up and speaks in front of people.
Besides that point, I want to just say, Moses mentioned like before the event, like how he was feeling. I have a story, which we can call it an empowering belief here, which goes back to high school. I had an oral communication class in which we had to stand up in front of the class and give presentations. And high school wasn't my cup of tea, if you will. So preparing for classes and all that stuff was my jive. So I was called up to do this presentation that I was supposed to be preparing for all week. And I go up there, no prep, no anything, stand in front of the podium. First thing is I feel all of those emotions, all of those knees are shaking, hands clammy, fingers just, and trying to hide it. And then in that moment, I almost like passed out, I felt like. But then I came to and I hear myself talking. Hear myself talking about an incident that happened to me 2 weeks before, which was a car accident. And I'm describing it in detail. And in that moment, as I'm speaking about this thing and everything, I almost have like an outer body experience where I'm seeing everyone, I'm hearing myself talk. And in that moment, I'm like, yo, I'm really good at this. So because of that story, because of that perspective, I now see these moments with excitement because I have that story. But it could easily as well be any of the 1,000 other times that I had stories that would disprove that. But that's where we have the opportunity to see these moments, how well you guys did when you came up here and express, right? You mentioned how you're like, I'm doing pretty well, right? These are moments where we can attach a cookie to. What we call a cookie is a moment in time when you saw yourself perform at a thing, and now you can bring that out anytime that you're having a similar situation where like, oh, I did this one thing in the past. So now you're using that to propel you in that experience now. Does that make sense? So every moment that we're present, that we're aware, every moment that we're experiencing are opportunities to build up those cookies. You're talking to someone and you're hyper present, listening. There's a meaning behind there that we can attach. A meaning that we can attach that's dependent on our perspective. Oh wow, I was really present in that conversation. I must be a great person to talk to. And sometimes our judgment comes in and say, oh, you're being so egocentric. You're being so self-righteous. I say, don't do that. Don't feel that way. And we suppress ourselves, right? But again, the awareness of recognizing that that's a judgment, the other one's a judgment, and we can choose because we know what we're working towards. We're working towards becoming better human beings, better versions of ourselves. And what does lead me to, what action, what interpretation leads me towards that is the one that serves me. So it's always a question about what serves me. for what I want. So there's a thing that was kind of constant with everyone's definition. It was about showing up, right? Sharing something of you. But there was also another aspect where it was about, a lot of people mentioned fear, right? Either mentioned it or hinted towards it. With vulnerability, it cannot exist if fear doesn't exist. So in order for us to be vulnerable, we need to be afraid of something first. Whether it's a judgment, whether it's an outcome, whatever it is, there has to be some fear present that we're going to use courage towards. Now, vulnerability isn't necessarily just being an open book and sharing everything, right? Because again, now we look at that, like, okay, if you share everything about yourself, there's also no fear. There's nothing that makes you feel uncertain about that. So vulnerability is specific to you and your perceptions. So when you use awareness to recognize your perception on a thing, and then you decide to be vulnerable with that thing, and it doesn't have to be external. Like, we're doing this group activity here, we're being vulnerable with each other. It doesn't have to be that way only. Because again, like we talked about, you could be in a situation where vulnerability is something that you shouldn't use because you need to protect yourself. Like in that childhood, right? Being vulnerable wasn't going to help you. But recognizing the spaces that you can be vulnerable, which foundationally, the space you want to always work on being vulnerable, no matter what the external circumstances are, is within self, with these conversations with yourself. Because what that requires is for you to question your identity. And that's what ultimate vulnerability means.
That's the point. Brene Brown's definition is being exposed, showing up, telling a certain perception or truth of yourself that may have a judgment attached to it, without the expectation of controlling the outcome of that expression. So if I say something to you about myself, I'm going to feel all these different things. And the expectation, if I say this thing and then automatically I'm going to change, or you're going to accept me, or this situation is going to change, right? Is not real vulnerability, because the reason that you're saying that thing is to change something else because you don't like the way it feels. Vulnerability is just saying it because it's what exists inside here. Now, by me putting it out, whether it be to myself or to another individual, I give the opportunity to dismantle that story, that assumption, that belief. This is why it's so important. Because you give the opportunity to yourself to be able to start breaking that down. Is this thing real? Do I perceive this as my truth?
We talked about awareness is noticing the thing. Vulnerability is recognizing that thing on how it serves you, right? So if you have your armor up, your shield up, and you're going through life with this armor, protecting from everyone, there's never a point of vulnerability. There's never a point of changing what's behind our armor, of growing, of developing, right? But when we allow vulnerability in certain cases or with certain individuals, what that does, it allows us to connect at a deeper level with ourselves, right? So if I'm vulnerable with you, we're able to share a space of trust. If I'm vulnerable with myself, I'm able to share a space of trust within myself. And this now is the tools that we need to be able to use that awareness and create change.
So, how many of you have experienced some form of trauma in your life? Raise your hand. Right. So, why is vulnerability?
So I just want to point out, because the way the hands came up is like, you gonna make us talk about that?
No, we're not going to talk about it. I mean, I would love to, but I don't think we got enough time. That's what we do all day here at Vita Project. But
The idea behind all of this, though, is to give you the tools on how to deal with these things.
So vulnerability with self and vulnerability with someone else, they're a little bit different, okay? Vulnerability with someone else requires some form of trust, right? You need to be able to trust that person. So then how do we start to build or understand trust? Well, we need to learn ourselves, right? So if we have a story about our life, trauma, that we aren't necessarily being vulnerable about, how do we start to question the vulnerability? How do we start to identify that thing that makes us feel all kind of weird when we think about it? Well, we need to understand the concept of perception, right? So all of you see this chair, right?
Yes.
Do all of you see the same chair?
We're seeing it from different angles.
Right, okay.
Yeah, we see the same chair.
Okay, what do you see?
I've got the full back.
Okay, what do you see?
I got the side, well, the whole front and side.
Can you tell him any other like discoloration or kind of marks that he may not be able to see?
Yes. Little white little stuff in the chair, dots.
Okay, you guys get the point, right? All of you have different perceptions. Okay, why is this important for ourselves? Well, we have a story. The way the brain works, it literally records this experience right now like a video camera, like the ones you see behind you. Right? It's recording it. Our brain actually at night starts to decompress the file, starts to compress the file, right? It starts to take out the things that weren't important and take out the things that were important, right? So now how does it do that? It bases that decision on how emotional an experience was. So if this is your traumatic story right here, and you're where Melissa is, and you only see that one side, and you only remember that one side because of the emotional intensity that it had, which could be fear, you're going to remember this story as something that was fearful your entire life. And every single time that you experience something that triggers this story in your brain, you're going to get that same reaction. So you don't necessarily remember the details of the story. Matter of fact, you probably only remember 50%. According to studies, you only remember 50% of the details of a memory. The rest of that is made up by cognitive biases and prior knowledge. So half of your story isn't even real, but it's real to you. Why? Because of the emotion. That's why it's real. So now, how do we start to be vulnerable with that story? We have to question it. Is my perception the truth?
So this is one of my favorite topics, which is about truth, right? The idea that my perspective, the way I see this chair, is the true meaning of the chair, is the true form of the chair, is how this chair exists. If I'm only able to accept my truth, that means that Melissa's angle of this chair is wrong. It cannot exist because mine is the only truth. But what if we question that? What if we said that my perspective is truth, Melissa's perspective is also truth? Javier, Christina's, Zanella, they all have truth in their perspective. What does that allow me to do? It allows me to see much more.
The infinite amount of solutions that exist, the infinite amount of possibilities that exist with that story. That's vulnerability with self. Right? It's bringing that story up, the assumptions that are behind that story, why your mom did the thing that your mom did, right? Why your ex did the thing that your ex did. And you start to kind of put yourself in their positions and start to question, well, did I have any fault in this? Maybe I'm actually the innocent one, maybe I'm not the victim, maybe I am the victim. You start to question all the possibilities. Now, this is actually what therapists do. They take out the story and they make you talk about it, right? And then they ask you questions to guide you and better understand it, right? And then you save the story a little bit differently, right? Because now the emotion that's attached while they're questioning you starts to kind of change. But then if you think about this, you can go to your friend that always agrees with you. How many of you have friends like that? That always agrees with you. And you tell them this horrible, traumatic story and you know, you're right. He shouldn't have done that to you. He's an asshole. He's a fucking dick, right? And you're like, yeah. All she's doing or all their friend is doing is solidifying your perspective.
Yeah.
A therapist, you go to a therapist, they come with an unbiased perspective. They just question you. So then they allow you to take that memory out. They ask you questions. You're like, oh, wow, I never thought about that. Okay, let me go home and think about it some more. And then you save it. Now the emotional intensity of that memory no longer exists, which allows you to start accepting that story about yourself. That's what therapy does. That's a skill you can do.
Which is a key point. The big factor of that is taking it out of here and observing it, right? Using that awareness, taking it out of here, because the thing is that we have, like Moses mentioned, in our nervous system, we have neurons that fire together and wired together. And every time we think about that thing, that memory gets stronger and stronger, right? But the thing is, we don't think about it with awareness. We don't think about it with vulnerability. We think about it just to represent our standing on it. So what I mean by that is we think of that trauma the same way we thought about that trauma every single time, just reinforcing it. We're that friend to ourselves. So then in the moment that we actually remove and use that observer to look at this thing and try to see if I can look at it from a different angle. Just imagine, use my creativity to imagine different angles, different possibilities. That skill allows us to look outside of our internal world. And taking that internal world, bringing it out, is what allows us to be vulnerable. Because we're questioning that thing. Most of the time, I don't know if anyone has experienced this. You're thinking, to this Saturday, I gotta do this. Oh my God, how am I gonna do this? And then you take a moment and you write down a list of the things you gotta do. And you're like, oh, not too bad. I can get this done. Or, you know what? I can't get half of this done. It's just not possible. And then all of a sudden, this brings calm to you because you saw the things that are possible. So literally taking it out from here and putting it out so that you can observe it allows you to see a whole different perspective.
You know, you said being vulnerable with yourself is like the utmost level of vulnerability, which I agree with, but I think the healing comes from sharing it.
Yeah.
Like, I think as human beings, we are wired for connection, right? So when it's witnessed and you're heard and it's like accepted, that's where healing, I think, comes in. Mm-hmm. So to notice it in yourself is one level, but I don't know, I have this dilemma where I feel like it's only healed when it's observed by someone else.
So that's a great point. I agree with you. Where I'm going to say the difference. The noticing is the awareness, right? The vulnerability is the questioning of your perception. Now, taking those perceptions and expressing it to the world is a form of healing. I believe questioning the perception in the moment that you are is like, these are the different possibilities that exist in the story that's in my head. Now, if that story involves another individual, right? It's sharing that perspective with that individual that allows that healing to occur if that story is with that individual. Let's say the story is with an individual that passed away. It's going to be hard to heal based on that because of that individual leaving, right? That's no longer here. Maybe you can get perspectives or different angles from the individual around that person, right? To understand why this person was the way they were or why it happened the way it did. But ultimately, in that case scenario, the healing is going to have to come within at one point, and that comes from questioning the different perspectives. So when I talk about, or when we talk about vulnerability, it's more about questioning your assumptions and stories that you have behind the thing that you are thinking about. Not so much the noticing. The noticing is obviously the first step. It's awareness, right? The sharing with others, 100% healing, right? It's the sharing the assumptions and the perspectives with others, but that can also be done with self. If I have a story with Beverly, I have to share my assumptions and stories with Beverly, right? And that's how we get to heal. That's how I get to heal. I can share my stories and assumptions about other things in my life if I feel comfortable with Beverly, and she can give me insight, which is what coaching is used for, therapists, right? Counselors, all of these things. If I express that with somebody else, I give myself an opportunity to heal as well, because I get to say it. So yes, you're right. I just want to make that clarity is noticing is the awareness, and challenging the multiple perspectives that you have is the vulnerability.
Which I agree with. Like, I had that understanding, but I think that's like the beginning process, is the vulnerability within yourself. And I feel like that's more the beginning than the end. I don't know, it's just something that I was thinking about.
It's interesting. So, like, the concept of the end, right? The moving past it, right? It's what we tend to associate with that idea of like, okay, I got over this thing. I got over this thing. Meaning that I'm no longer gaining a response to when I think of this thing, right? Say it's a breakup, a loss. But I think there's something else there. I think there's a level of acceptance of either the situation, of yourself, right? And that acceptance is that empowering aspect that allows healing. Because healing is, if you think of like a physical response, because here we work with the physical and the mind because we see them as one, right? So it's easy to illustrate a physical injury. And a physical injury, let's say I get a cut on my arm, right? And throughout the year, that never closes because I'm constantly pulling it apart and watching the blood flow out, right? Never allowing it to actually heal, never letting the body get in there and see what the problem is and bring the cells to repair it, right? Me getting in the way of that is what doesn't allow me to heal. So healing is allowed when we recognize and accept the situation and can see ourselves and understand ourselves and have compassion for ourselves, as well as have compassion for others, whether they did harm to us. And that releases that charge, the compassion. So I agree with you with speaking to others is a great form of practicing that perspective. Can someone heal without the connection to others? That's something that we can dive into and really discuss. Because if we think of moments in history where traumatic things occurred, so say Nazi Germany, concentration camps, you see how individuals in that survive to this day. All right, they may share their story and everything. Did they ever heal from it? Like, what is the end? Was it the heal? Was the overcoming? Maybe some healed and no longer even have any type of reaction to it from that perspective of healing. Or maybe some understood acceptance of the situation and allowed them to not stay in that moment in time, but continue to create new moments in time. So it really falls down to what we mean by healing. And then the question comes to, what do we mean by it? What is the judgment that we place on what was healed and what wasn't? Because I'm coming back to the cut in my arm. Is it healed if I have giant scar tissue? Or is it only healed when it's smooth? Right? To me, scar tissue is that I'm able to move on with that experience. And the expectation of it completely being smooth, that non-existence, is me creating that sensation that I should be able to not even have any connection to this thing and move on. So I think it becomes a different discussion of that.
By connection, the last thing you said, by connection, do you mean reaction? Because it's always going to be integrated into our stories.
Exactly, and that's what I'm saying by how do we define healing? Is that the outcome that we're waiting for, that we're no longer affected in any way by this experience? Or is it accepting the experience, accepting the impact that it had, and then being able to move on in the sense of continuing to create new experiences, or staying present and stuck in that experience as time passes?
I guess that depends on the individual.
Exactly.
Their interpretation and their intention behind the work that they're doing.
One last thing though, what Christina's saying though is a little bit like what you guys are talking about with taking it out of here and making it real outside of yourself, because now you're able to react to, and I mean, we're just kind of going in circles, but that I don't know. As I listen to it, I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah, fundamentally, it's about our perception of what we see, our perception of healing, our perception of the story that is causing the trauma, and understanding all of that with awareness, with vulnerability, to see more perceptions, more angles, to me is what allows us to do what we're here to do. Here is to grow, to be present in life, to make something of ourselves. However we define what we're here to do, that's where it comes back to. Like, how do we define what is healing? What is all of that? It all comes back down to what are we moving towards.
Any other questions?
Thoughts?
Statements, thoughts? All right. We're gonna move on to the human needs. So go ahead, Francis. You can start from here, and then I'll take it.
So because I wanted to mention it before, the pain-pleasure concepts, I'll start with that one, which is, again, with that angle of how we see it, right? We always we'd like to think of ourselves very complex individuals. But in reality, we're very simple in how we react to things, right? What actions, what decisions we make. Things are either causing pain and therefore we're trying to get away from it, or pleasure, therefore we're running towards it, right? Fear, trying to get away from it, or hope, trying to work towards it. So when we look at that whole idea of perspective. So for one person in this room, doing a hard workout that's gonna leave you feeling like jello can be the most painful thing that you can imagine to do. It's like, why would you do that? For someone else in this room, be like, yo, that sounds like a great Saturday night. Right? So with understanding that, we can see that we're going to decide our action of if we're going to do that today based off of either that fear or that hope, that pain or that pleasure. So that's always involved, no matter how complex the decision is that we're trying to make. If we look at where the motivation of that energy is coming from either that pain or that pleasure. It's coming from that fear or that hope. So identifying that root motive allows us to now create more clarity. And also sometimes question, wait, is this something that I really should be feared? Something that should be pain? And maybe, just maybe, we can attach the different meaning to it. So this thing that I saw as pain actually is pleasure, because it's pleasure towards what I'm trying to create rather than what I will feel instantaneously in this moment.
So creating the awareness around the connotation you have behind the word of pain and pleasure. Good and bad, right, wrong, right? Like if we see pain as a bad thing, right, then you're not going to do anything that causes you pain. Well, according to Francis's theory, somebody can perceive working out as painful. Can working out be good for you? Eating a piece of cake could be pleasurable. Eat a piece of cake every day, what happens?
Yeah.
Right? It can lead to diabetes, which then causes. To me, it has both. Everything exists within that one thing that you view. It's how are you perceiving it, which is what Rances spoke about. That's important. What is the connotation you're putting in? What's the label you're putting on that thing? Create an awareness around that. There's a story behind that, which is what we're going to do now. We're going to go into that work.
So I'll let you jump into the human needs to keep it, because I tend to talk too much.
All right. So humans, we have 6 human needs. I forgot the psychologist's name. This is what he identified in people, what we need. And there's no specific order, but there is just one that we may value in a certain point in time more than the other. So certainty. Certainty is understanding that something exists, that it's there, you feel confident in it. It could be your job, it could be your family. Right? It gives you some form of understanding and like foundation in your life, right? Variety means you're getting different things, different experiences, different emotions elsewhere. You may, say it again?
Stimuli.
Yeah, stimuli. You can get that from food. You can get that like for dancers, right? Going to a dance party and dancing with different people, going to a club, right? Going to network events. That could be your variety. You get your variety from your workouts, right? That's another human need. Love and connection, right? I feel that it's pretty self-explanatory. It could be connection in this form. It can be love intimately with your family, friendships, any of those things. We're going to need that in our life. Significance. Significance is pretty interesting because people may see that as egocentric, right? But significance is just being known that someone's watching you, that sees you, identifies you, is aware that you exist, that you're important, that you're there, right? Growth, we need to feel like we're always moving forward in a direction, that we got a vision, that we're moving towards that vision. That makes us feel like sometimes enduring that pain is worth it. And then contribution. What are we contributing beyond us to the people around us? Right? These 6 human needs are something that we always look for. We may value one more than the other at one point in our lives, but we always look for these things somewhere.
And it's important to identify that these needs, you're having them met one way or another. Okay, so the question always arises with, are you, again, what I'm trying to build with my life, is this the place where I want to receive this need from? Right? So like Moses mentioned, certainty a lot of times comes from work, right? Certainty is the fact that I'm going to get paid on monthly or weekly or bi-weekly, whatever. There's that certainty behind that. So when you look at that, you can say, okay, this certainty brings me what I need, what I want. I'm happy with it being fulfilled there, right? But if that certainty now is in question, so your job is saying, we're gonna do a bunch of layoffs. Now that certainty gets questioned. Now you're shaken to the core. So you ask yourself, am I confident receiving my certainty here? Do I want to find another place to find my certainty where will keep me grounded, will keep me in my direction that I'm trying to build for my life? So there's always also understanding where these needs are being met from.
And by creating awareness around where you're getting these needs met, you can start to make changes. So like Rance's example of work. I hate my job, right? I hate my job. I hate what I do. Why do you stay there? Well, maybe it provides you certainty. Maybe it provides you significance. Maybe if you hate it, I probably don't think you're growing much, but maybe you're contributing. I don't know. You're getting some type of need met, which is why you're not willing to let it go. Why you are not willing to let it go now falls into the belief, right? Why am I not willing to quit my job and do what I really want to do? Why am I not willing to change my health? What's stopping me? Well, there's a belief that's stopping you. But that thing that you keep questioning, that you're building awareness around, is serving one of these needs. And if the belief is, subconsciously, if you take that thing out, you're gonna lose this need. So in the example of Francis's, working, right? Your job, you feel if you leave your job, certainty goes out the window. And certainty is number one for you in your life, you're not gonna quit your job.
Because of the pain associated to it.
Right? Same thing with it could be with working out or nutrition. Right? We have certain beliefs. Oh, well, I've eaten this way for my entire life, right? And food gives me variety. It gives me love, right? And those are the most important things for me. And if I take this piece out, this piece of cake that I love to eat every single day, which for me has lately been a crumb cake from Roasted, but promo. That crumb cake, right? If I take this out, then I'm no longer going to be happy, right? So now my pleasure is gone. Therefore, I associate taking this thing out of my diet as pain. It's more painful than it is pleasurable. So now I'm not going to take that action.
So with that, what we want to do is look at our lives and see our beliefs. We're going to do a little bit of a visual here on how beliefs exist. We go through, remember how I mentioned the cookies, the experiences we go through, right? And the stories that we attach to those experiences, those stories build up. Those stories combine together to bundle up together to support a belief. So we're going to show you guys how we take our stories, our beliefs, and observe the stories using that awareness, using that vulnerability to look for other perspectives, understanding that our needs are being supported by this perspective, and then bring questions to it to be able to decide, is this thing serving me? Is it not serving me? Because I'm trying to do this with myself.
So I should have let Rancis draw the table because he's the artist. But this is it is a belief. I mean, it's a belief I'm willing to accept. I'm not trying to be an artist, so it's okay. I got the artist here, so I'll let him draw. That's going back to connection. Use him to be able to do that for me. Belief, right? So we have a belief, a certain thing that we believe about ourselves, right? It can be empowering or limiting. Right? It could serve us or it cannot serve us. What holds up this belief, and this is Tony Robbins' example and analogy towards this, this is not original from us, is the story. So if it's a limiting belief, it's held up by a bunch of stories, which are the legs of the table.
Limiting or empowering, it could be either way, the same structure.
So now, the question is, how do we start to use this analogy, right, to start changing beliefs about ourselves? Well, we identify what is stopping us, right? What is the belief? I am a passive individual that cannot make decisions. Okay, that's the belief.
Let's take when everyone stood up here, right? How the way you felt about this, like Moses mentioned, came flooding with stories, right? There's a belief about yourself. Christina, you mentioned, I'm used to being the presenter, so now being on this side, right? I don't know how to handle this, right? I'm used to passing out when I stand up, right? So like these beliefs about ourselves, how we interpret ourselves, are supported by the stories, by the experience, by those moments in time that we captured, and we've said, okay, put this into this collection. That support.
So then how do we start to break those stories down? Well, we create awareness around the story that's holding up the belief. So we identify the belief. We then say, okay, what's the first story that comes up in my head to hold that table up, to hold that belief up? Okay, great. I know the story. Vulnerability. You take the vulnerability, you put it out in front. and you start to observe all the different possibilities, why that exists in your head. What are all the different infinite possibilities that are there and why it's holding up the belief? And then you start to look for the different perceptions and possibilities that can empower you or destroy this belief. We start to take out, okay, let's say I'm not able to express anger. That was a belief I had about myself for a very long time. The story was, my dad was angry. Don't be like dad. Rancis, I took a coach, paid him, said, hey, Rancis, this is my belief. Coach said, what's wrong with anger? Oh, shit. Can't anger be used to protect, to defend? My judgment on anger was the thing that didn't allow me to express anger, because I believed that it was the wrong thing to do. So he took the same story that I had with my father and said, maybe your father is trying to protect you. Maybe he doesn't know what you feel or experience. Maybe you weren't being vulnerable. Now I can start to look at my father as a human being who just expressed anger, a human emotion. Now I can destroy the belief of, I never express anger. I do express anger. Does that make sense?
Wow,
Like
that's
that.
a lot. That has a lot of meaning.
So if you guys remember, I talked about my public speaking, right? On the empowering belief. So that story of when I was a kid in high school. So that's the story. My belief is, I'm great at this. I'm great at talking to a group of people. That's the belief. Now this is on the empowering aspect. So now I look at the stories, and like I said, there's tons of other stories that would disprove that. But it's the perspective that I decide to look at that story, right? Because there were other moments in that same class where I stepped up and I was like, right? Which always makes me, I don't want to talk about Inside Out, but it always makes me think of that. It's a Pixar movie, which Pixar movies are super deep if you never watched any of them. But Inside Out is about this character who we go inside and see her emotions, right? What we learn throughout the movie is that happiness is always what's trying to lead all her choices. And she's always trying to suppress sadness. And then we find out that all the stories that she holds up as these were happy moments had another side to them, which involved sadness. So she can only experience this happiness because of the sadness, because accepting all the human emotions rather than trying to only live in one emotion was what allowed her to have these experiences. So now we look at all of our experiences and we recognize that they have the potential to have different perspectives. They have the potential to be sad. They have the potential to be happy, fearful, all the things that we want to think about. And we use that skill to reimagine our beliefs, and then we can create and turn them into what we want to propel ourselves towards.
Okay, so let's do this activity. You're going to do a teaching turn, but in the teaching turn, we're going to be a little bit more specific. You're going to get 5 minutes. I want you guys to identify a limiting belief or an empowering belief, either or, whichever one you're more comfortable with. And I want you to identify the first story that comes up in your head that holds that belief up with each other. So you guys will get 5 minutes, spend 2.5 identifying the belief. If it's empowering or limiting, doesn't matter which one. And then what's the first story that comes up? And then just talk about it. Just kind of identify why this came up, why this exists, and share with each other. All right? Ready? Go.
So recognize this is going to practice all these
You're
skills.
practicing all the components.